Welcome back to the morning show here on Arise News. I'm Tundra Abiola.
Good morning. Welcome back. I'm Veronica Odeka.
And I'm Biola Labi.
Our next guest is an academic who served as Rivers State Commissioner of Information and Communications from 2015 to 2017, when he voluntarily resigned from Governor Nyesom Wike's cabinet. Before his appointment, he was Executive Director of the Institute of Communication and Corporate Studies. As an academic, he taught at the Pan-African University in Nigeria and at University of Cape Town, South Africa, where he was an Andrew W. Mellon Postdoctoral Research Fellow. In 2008, he worked as a research consultant to the New Partnership for Africans Development in its good governance monitoring projects across Africa. We are now joined by Dr. Austin Tam-George, who will be looking at why Nigerian citizens must be alive at all times to the responsibility of holding their leaders accountable. You are welcome to the program, Doctor.
Thank you for having me.
It's good
to have you on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So it's good to have you. One of the things that we said in your opening was that it's important to be alive, for Nigerians to be alive, to holding candidates accountable. Why did you feel this was extremely important to have, and do you think that this upcoming election is going to be about the issues, or are we going to lose the plot?
Well, I think that one of the tragedies of our democratic practice in this country is that we have sort of ritualized elections as part of simply going to cast votes every 4 years. And then as soon as these guys are elected into public office, there's a tendency for the rest of the people to then recline, allow the politicians to do their job. But, you cannot always expect politicians to hold themselves to account. So I think that we need a broadening of our understanding of how democracy works beyond simply holding elections every 4 years. So I think that we need to establish a mechanism of accountability such that after the elections have been conducted and candidates have emerged, we need to be alive. We need to make sure that they fulfill their promises. We need to make sure that there is a mechanism of accountability. My sense in observing the process over the past decade or so is that there is a lethargy in terms of citizens coming out to say, look, you said you were going to build hospitals. You said you were going to make sure you prioritize schools. You said you were going to make sure that you lift people out of poverty. We haven't seen all of this. Beyond the elections, how can we make sure that people actually live up to their responsibilities in public office? I think that is a missing link, and we need to revalorize that important component of our democracy.
I have wanted to ask you something.
You came prepared today.
Well,
you were like ready.
These type of things. All of this is well and very important, and you have an extensive background in your education on communication and making sure that people are informed. So while it's all good and well, we understand that we need to ask these questions, but sometimes people don't know what questions to ask, and we don't know how to go about making sure that they are held accountable. So having been a commissioner for information and communication, what would be your advice to the Nigerian public as to how to go about making sure that we're holding our leaders responsible and not waiting to every 4 years for the election, but what are some of the processes you can take us to make sure that we're doing the right thing?
That's an excellent question. I think education plays a very important role. Except you have information, you can't be a productive, useful member of a democratic process. In Finland, for instance, because of the centrality of information, because of the importance of education in making informed choices, not just choices, but informed choices, what the government there has done is to make sure that internet access is embedded in the Constitution as a constitutional right. And a certain amount of bandwidth is allocated to each citizen to make sure that they have free access to information. So you can see that democracy goes beyond simply holding elections and voting your so-called favorite candidates. You need to make choices, all right, but you need to also make informed choices. And, in practice, what we've seen, unfortunately, in this country is that because of lack of proper education, because of lack of access to information, people still vote according to primordial considerations, such as, does the person worship in the same church? Does he worship in the same God that I do? Is he from my place? There's a tendency in which tribalism has a strong pull upon our people. So I am advocating for extensive and deep education so that people can understand that their material conditions are directly connected to the quality of leaderships that are produced. Unfortunately, because we don't have that level of education, people tend to become more and more superstitious about their circumstances. When people are poor, they think Satan is responsible or somehow God doesn't like them. But the truth is that there is a direct connection between poor governance and the material conditions of our people.
Fair enough.
You mentioned the internet. Can we discuss the role of social media in holding governments accountable, bearing in mind that some social media critics have been arrested by the government, namely Deji Adeyanju and Segun Onibio, people like that? How does intimidation now play a part in trying to hold the government accountable?
I have taught the social media in the university for quite a while, and I'm a practitioner because, I mean, we all have social media accounts, and we try to put our views out there. The social media space is a very valid, very important space because there's a sense in which it has helped to democratize participation in public discourse. But it is also an ungoverned space because, there are no obvious editors. People just put out content. And increasingly, we've seen that those who are active in the social media space do not sometimes follow standard ethics of information dissemination and generation. So it's a very, should I say, promiscuous space because all kinds of people have access. But it is also important because, we no longer have traditional gatekeepers, deciding what kind of information goes out and what kind of information doesn't go out. So it's a very important space if we use it responsibly. Should the government or any kind of structure try to regulate what happens in the social media space? That is an open question because, more and more people are beginning to align the social media with national security. So a lot of people are thinking that, look, if we allow this space to be unregulated, people could start all kinds of fires across the country. And there is a sense in which you could argue for some kind of oversight. But generally, we've also seen a tendency by authoritarian regimes or intolerant regimes to try to silence people who are critical of bad policies, who are critical of failures of government. And I think that what needs to be done is to strike a balance between allowing free speech, free expression, and also knowing that, with that freedom comes a great deal of responsibility. I think that is the balance that needs to be struck. I am all for social media and democratization of the space for free expression. But I think that those who have the opportunity to use the social media also should exercise a great deal of restraint.
Thank you. You said education, making sure people understand their rights, making sure people are politically aware, and that's going to be a lot of education. Where elections are around the corner, how do we, when we talk about education, what does that mean? Also, too, there's a saying that all politics is local politics. How does language play a huge part into how we educate people, make sure people stay informed, and actually that decision that they're casting at the ballot is the right decision for them? How do we make sure that all those things are done? But also, what role does language play in that?
Education leads eventually, I suppose, to learning. And this is not something that happens in a flash. Education is by nature, organically, an osmotic process. It happens by osmosis. It happens gradually. And so that's why, for instance, you go into the university, it takes a whole 4 years for you to get a certificate. They could have given you the certificate on the very moment of registration, but they know that a great deal of learning has got to happen. So it's an osmosis process. Now, we need to make sure that all agencies of public enlightenment function, both in traditional centers of learning, such as universities and primary schools, even kindergarten levels of schools, through civic education, so that people will know that, they have a role to play in the kind of society that they envision. It cannot drop from the skies. It is up to us to make sure that we make children at a very primary level of education to know that, look, you need to make sure that the environment you live in is clean, and it's your responsibility to be part of that process. Those who are elected to serve you are there actually to serve you, and that if they don't serve you, you have the right to remove them. This is not hearsay, it's a constitutional provision. Now, we need to make sure that citizens internalize these responsibilities and the sacrifices that also come with this. So are we going to have a sudden burst of education simply because we have elections 3 months away? No. But the National Orientation Agency, for instance, these are very specific designated institutions that can help with mass education. Have they done a lot? I don't see a lot of that happening. So I think that it is something that can happen both at informal and formal levels of citizenship education, including redesigning curriculum in schools to make sure that the right content and learning outcomes are expected from those processes. Concerning language, I think that sometimes even the word campaign has a military origin. A lot of people associate, campaign with military tradition because, there's a sense in which you go out and you make a case, and, but what we need to do is to make sure that we exercise a great deal of restraint. I am an advocate of issue-based politics. We have the highest maternal mortality rate in the world. We have the highest number of poor people in the world in this country. We have one of the largest infrastructural deficits in Africa for a country with the kind of resource profile that we have. So we have a vast array of issues that ought to occupy our campaign. So my own suggestion would be to say that, look, political actors should make sure they conduct their political campaigns around issues that concern everyone. Poor housing. We do not have we still do not have the kind of internet and information penetration that we deserve. Even if when you live in the city, the temptation is to think that every person has a telephone. But a lot of our people still do not have access to the things we take for granted in the cities. We still need to make sure that our education, which used to be the envy of the world in the 70s, in the late 60s and 70s, today has broken down. We need to make sure that our leaders recognize that these things can't change simply by wishful thinking. We need the kind of quality of leadership that puts attention on these issues. But my suspicion is that we do not yet have the political class of participants that can bring these issues to focus, because it is in their interest to divide the people along tribal lines, because the more our people are collectivized, the more they ask the more important questions. But the more divided they are and fighting among themselves, the more the serious issues are submerged. So it is in the interest of the political class to make sure that very serious issues of performance and accountability are submerged, in public discourse. So it is up to citizens to make sure that these issues are brought to the surface and leaders are engaged on these issues. Expecting politicians to hold themselves to account is like expecting landlords to have an emergency meeting on how to reduce rents.
So is it fair to say that you believe that the current political class in Nigeria is exploitative to the citizen?
Political class difference, I suppose, is the quality of institutions across countries. So, some people might think that, well, if you go to the US, it's better. It's better because there's a long tradition of institutions, rising to challenges of
and checks and balances.
Yes, there are checks and balances. But in Nigeria, because of the fragility of our institutions, we still do not have those kind of institutional mechanisms to hold leaders to account, which is why I think it is important that we start the process to make sure there is mass education. There is the civil society space in Nigeria is still very fragile and fragmentary. And so you do not have that institutional energy, that kinetic energy to say, look, leaders, why don't you come and have these debates? How can we make sure that budgets are properly implemented? How can we make sure that expenditure matches reality on the ground? How can we make sure that all of these things happen? Politicians themselves cannot hold themselves to account.
So, exactly. And so with that being said, so how would you gauge the level of political awareness of the Nigerian people, especially now that we're getting ready to head into the elections? Do you think that we are aware, or do you think that we are not aware, or we are aware and we're just choosing, like you said, to follow tribal partisans to vote? Or do you think
we're not aware, I'm sorry to say, because a lot of our people are very poor. And the extent of poverty, the depth of poverty that we have in this country is state-sponsored poverty, because we do not have any reason to be poor. And you see, being poor by itself is not so much of a problem, but it becomes a problem, a disabling problem, because you become eternally engaged with matters of survival. You're talking about house rent, you're talking about paying school fees, you're talking about, meeting medication requirements for your children. Now, the more and more we have people preoccupied with this kind of banal issues, the less and less they are able to ask questions about accountability. Concepts about democracy become very abstract concepts for these people, because the urgency of their circumstances doesn't permit them to engage in more important issues. So you see that we have regimes that take a cynical interest in keeping the people poor. The poorer people are, the less likely that they will have to ask those kind of very vital questions around accountability. Or, of course, there is a nexus between poverty and also the quality of education that people tend to have. So the poorer people are, the less and less good quality that they take. And without this kind of connection being understood, you are dealing with a double whammy. People are poor, they have poor education, they are therefore unable to rise to the challenge of citizenship. So that is exactly what we are facing.
What channels exist right now whereby people can effectively call leaders into account? And can you tell us what kind of questions we should be asking of the executive? What should we be demanding of the legislature, of the judiciary, even the press?
Yes, let me start with the press, since we are in the, since we are in the media house. You see, even the space for journalistic practice in this country is endangered. Endangered in the sense that we are seeing the ownership landscape in the media space shifting gradually towards political ownership. We are tending to see a situation where more and more prominent politicians are beginning to own media houses, are beginning to own media outfits. Therefore, we see that a lot of professionalism is now eroded, because the workers, the journalists who function in some of these media houses are on the payroll of the owners of these media houses. And these owners are typically, increasingly, political actors. So you see that there is a sense in which the media landscape in Nigeria is changing now more than it was some 2 decades ago. So that's one part. Objectivity, professionalism, training, and the rest of them are beginning to suffer a diminution. The second point about the media is that we've seen that the Nigerian media practitioners are perhaps some of the poorest paid in the world, I'm sorry to say. I have had some contact with, because of my work and exposure, I've had I've had the access to all kinds of media practitioners across the world. And I've seen that compared to their Nigerian counterparts, a lot of the journalists abroad on CNN, BBC, VOA, and the rest of them do a lot better. If a CNN correspondent were to cover an event in Kano, for instance, he's going to have a blank check. He's going to fly business class. He's going to mobilize all resources to make sure he's at the scene where the thing is happening. His Nigerian counterpart will probably travel by night bus to Kano. No, so you see a lot of, disparity in the working conditions, and therefore the extent of professionalism that you would expect from media practitioners. That is affecting professional media practice in this country. That's one part. The second part has to do with the kind of questions we should be asking. We should be asking, as I said in my introduction, what kind of leadership should we have in this country, and why is it so difficult to attain it 58 years after independence? Why do we still have dysfunctional cities? Why do we find refuse collection and management such a Herculean task? This is something that these are things that are taken for granted in places with just exactly the same kind of resource profile as we have.
But what channels should we direct the questions? The
media plays a very important role. Traditional rulers have a very important role because they have direct access to these people and they can explain to them that, look, things are not working, not because somehow we are on the wrong side of divine favor, but because of failure.
What about civil society? I mean, I'm just trying to think. I'm a regular citizen. I'm trying to figure out what questions to ask. I have these questions. Who do I ask them to?
You can go to the media and ask the questions. Why can't we get things right? But the question is, asking the question is one thing. Getting answers is another matter. And even when you get the answers, what do you do with the answers? So it's a whole chain of issues in the spectrum. It's not enough.
I'm just needing answers to make my decision on who to vote for. So let's, because I don't want, I mean, they're bigger. I mean, some of the things you're talking about are much more existential issues, which are bigger than us today. I'm just saying, if we were to sit down today, I'm sitting there, I know you're saying like from kindergarten, let's start educating people. Once again, that's future. But I am still here trying to decide who am I going to vote for.
For instance, if you're asking questions about the 13 million Nigerian children that are out of school, the highest number of children out of school in the world, you ought to ask questions around competence in the information ministry. And you see, in the education ministry, and in Nigeria, we have education ministries in all the 36 states. All right? We have an education ministry at the center, of course. So now you need to ask the Minister for Education, what specific policies, what particular implementation strategies do you have in place to make sure that this scandal doesn't is tackled.
So if I hear from a candidate that a candidate has a plan specifically for these 13 million children that are out of school, and that plan is in line with my philosophy, that is what you're advising people
You can then cast your vote, but then you don't cast your vote and go to sleep.
Okay.
As soon as these individuals are elected, under whatever political auspices, you need to be able to say, now we need specific timelines on your deliverables. How do you intend to tackle this problem? Citizenship is a full-time job.
Once every 4 years.
So it's not something that happens and then you just recline. You need to be constantly engaged. Look at what is happening in France over the past few days. Citizens are taking responsibility to say, look, this is not the direction we want our country to go. You don't have that sense of civic engagement in this country. One, because there are all kinds of existential issues. People are wrestling with all kinds of points of tension in their lives. So for them, there are more immediate existential issues than issues about accountability and the rest of them. And the more and more they feel disconnected from the political process, the greater the liberty for political actors to then do exactly what they like. So we need to find that nexus between citizenship, active citizenship, and holding government officials to account. I say this thing with some sense of seriousness because I've been on both sides of the spectrum, and I recognize that it's very important for people outside of the gate to constantly probe defenses, to keep asking questions until they get answers. These answers are not going to come automatically. They are not going to even come willingly. But if we insist, my own experience in government is that if there is a strong citizenship insistence on getting answers, those answers will inevitably come.
Let me ask you this. You have been a commissioner for information and communication. Would it be something that you would be willing to go back into and doing again? And if you were not, or if you had the opportunity to consult, what would you advise should be the communication channels in government? Not even on a federal level, but more on a state level.
Yes, I mean, my role as commissioner was one of the best jobs I had done. I had done consulting for the African Union. I worked abroad. I taught in different universities. But having this direct responsibility to inform the people in Rivers State, to engage them on government programs, those were responsibilities I took very seriously. Yes. And as Commissioner for Information, I was also the spokesperson, not just of the government, but of the people. And so I took that responsibility very seriously. And I think that at the point when I was in that office, I made sure there was a constant link between my office and the people. I set up a social media unit, for instance, the first in the state since 1967, because today citizenship is disaggregated. What I mean is that there could be people, investors who are in New Zealand or in Austria or in the UK who are actively interested in what is happening in my state. And so they can't be physically available in the state in order to see things for themselves. But through a social media department, set up, you could take questions from investors, from Rivers people all over the place, and you'll be able to open that channel of constant engagement. You see, but there's only as much as a single commissioner can do.
Yes.
There's a whole spectrum of authority, and you need to be able to work within the context. So my own concern, therefore, is to see how we could bring that sense of gravity and responsibility to public office. My sense is that politicians or those who occupy this public office are not going to wish that things go well on their own. But when there is a constant pressure, when there's an enlightened insistence that, look, we need to make sure we get things. When J.F. Kennedy was talking about how the highest office in the land is the office of citizen, I agree with him. Because once you are a citizen of the country or of a state, you have enormous powers, but it takes a great deal of self-development, education, a mass sensitization for people to say, look, we've got this right, now we've got to exercise it in the street. And once you do that, the gap begins to close and people are a bit more careful when they're in public office.
I want to ask you quickly, what has been the practical impact of the Freedom of Information Act with regards to public accountability?
This is a very interesting question because this is a matter I had handled both theoretically when I was outside of government and when I was
inside of government.
I was inside of government. When you are in government, you have not just access, but authority over information itself. And so there are certain kinds of information which people would want to get access to in order for them to make certain decisions. Now we have legislative support for that kind of inquiry through the Freedom of Information Act. But I keep telling people that it's not enough to have the best legislation in the world. You've got to test it. You've got to use it. Now, to use it, one, you have to be educated. Two, you have to be informed. Okay? And these are the two things I started by saying are missing in this country. We have the legislation to compel people to provide information. But do we have that critical mass of awareness to use this legislative tools?
So it's been underutilized?
Yes, in my own experience, it's been underutilized. So sometimes people say, I recall that when that Freedom of Information Act was passed by the Goodluck administration, there was a great deal of excitement. Yes, a great deal of excitement, even in the media community, to say, oh, at last we'll have as much information as we want. Yes, but the law is there, but do we get that sense that people are using it as much as they should? My answer is that there is no such awareness. That's number one. Number two, if people in government refuse to give the kind of information you're using the legislation to demand, how many people are going to the courts to say, look, this is a violation of what the law says? It's a whole stretch of issues.
Yes, but I mean, even so, in light of the fanfare and actually the usage, I am finding, one of the things I've picked up in a lot of the media and newspapers is that people are aware. Awareness is one of the first steps. People are aware, and there have been some requests, and some of those requests have not actually been heeded under this administration.
Yes.
So I think that's also another thing. Is so even if people are using it, how do we make sure that the government is also responsible?
You know this song by I think the Third World in the 80s. I don't know if you remember.
You're going way back. I know Third World.
Now that you found love, what do you want to do with it? So I think it applies here. Now you are aware that there is a Freedom of Information
Now you need
Act.
to use it.
What do you want to do with it? So being aware is just one.
That is such a good place to end the show. A good place to end this segment. So we're not going to let you go, but thank you so much for going. So now that we have found love, what are we going to do with it? So it's been a pleasure having you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's time now for a break. When we come back, Missy Adegoke, multimedia journalist and producer at BBC Africa, will be joining us to review the top newspaper headlines from around the country. Stay with us.